we're back. We're reading a book from 1791 called Visits from the World of Spirits, or Interesting Anecdotes of the Dead, containing very curious narratives of the appearances of many departed spirits on particular occasions to friends, relations, etc., being an impartial survey of the most remarkable accounts of apparitions, dreams, ghosts, specters, and visions that have been recorded in several ages of the world, together with some originals, to which is prefixed an introduction by the editor. And we're picking up right where we left off at Chapter 2. Let's not waste any more time because the title is long enough. Here we go. We're starting out with a story called The Apparition of a Gentleman to the Late Reverend and Learned Dr. Scott on account of an original deed belonging to his grandson's estate. The doctor was sitting alone by the fire, either in his study or in his parlor, in Broad Street where he lived, and reading a book, his door being fast shut and locked. He was well assured there was nobody in the room but himself, when accidentally raising his head a little, he was exceedingly surprised to see sitting in an elbow chair at the other side of the fireplace or chimney an ancient grave gentleman in a black velvet gown, a long wig, and looking with a pleasing countenance towards the doctor, as if just going to speak. The doctor, as we may reasonably suppose, was greatly surprised at the sight of him, and indeed, the seeing him as sitting in the chair was the most likely to be surprising, because the doctor, knowing the door to be locked, and then seeing a man sitting in the chair, he must immediately and at first sight conclude him to be a spirit, or apparition, or devil, call it as you will. Had he seen him come in at the door, he might at first have supposed him to be really a gentleman come to speak with him, and might think he had omitted fastening the door as he intended to have done. The doctor appeared in great disorder at the sight, as he acknowledged to those whom he told the story, and from whom, says my author, I received this account with very little remove of hands between. The spectre, it seems, began, for the doctor had not courage at first, as he said, to speak to it. I say the spectre or apparition spoke first, and desired the doctor not to be frightened, nor to be surprised, for that he would not do him any hurt, but that he came to him upon a matter of great importance to an injured family, which was in great danger of being ruined, and though he, the doctor, was a stranger to the family, yet knowing him to be a man of integrity, he had pitched upon him to do an act of very great charity as well as justice, and that he could depend upon him for a punctual performance. The doctor was not at first composed enough to receive the introduction of the business with a due attention, but seemed rather inclined to get out of the room if he could, and once or twice made some attempt to knock for some of the family to come up, at which the apparition appeared a little displeased. But it seems he need not, for, as the doctor said, he had no power to go out of the room if he had been next the door, or to knock for help if any had been at hand. But here the apparition, seeing the doctor still in confusion, desired him again to compose himself, for he would not do him the least injury, or offer anything to make him uneasy, but desired that he would give him leave to deliver the business he came about, which when he had heard, perhaps he would see less cause to be surprised or apprehensive than he did now. By this time, and by the calm way of discourse above mentioned, the doctor recovered himself so much, though not with any kind of composure, as to speak. "In the name of God," says the doctor, "what art thou?" "I desired you would not be frightened," says the apparition to him again. "I am a stranger to you, and if I tell you my name, you do not know it, but you may do the business without inquiring." The doctor continued discomposed and easy, and said nothing for some time. The apparition spoke again to him, not to be surprised, and received only for answer the old ignorant question, "In the name of God, who art thou?" Upon this the spectre seemed displeased, as if the doctor had not treated him with respect, and expostulated a little with him, telling him he could have terrified him into a compliance, but he chose to come calmly and quietly to him, and used some other discourses, so civil and obliging that by this time he began to be a little more familiar, and at length the doctor asked, "What is it you would have with me?" At this the apparition, as if gratified with the question, began his story thus. "I lived in the country of Somerset, where I left a very good estate, which my grandson enjoys at this time, but he is sued for the possession by my two nephews, the sons of my younger brother. Here he gave his own name, the name of his younger brother, and the names of his two nephews, but I am not allowed to publish the names in this relation, nor might it be proper for many reasons. The doctor then interrupted and asked him how long the grandson had been in possession of the estate, which he told him was 7 years, intimating that he had been so long dead. Then he went on and told him that his nephews would be too hard for his grandson in the suit, and would deprive him of the mansion house and estate, so that he would be in danger of being entirely ruined and his family reduced. Still the doctor could not see into the matter, or what he could do to remedy the evil that threatened the family, and therefore asked him some questions, for now they began to be a little better acquainted than at first. Says the doctor, "And what am I able to do in it, if the law be against him?" "Why," says the spectre, "it is not that the nephews have any right, but the grand deed of settlement, being the conveyance of the inheritance, is lost, and for want of that deed they will not be able to make out their title to the estate." "Well," says the doctor, "and still what can I do in the case?" "Why," says the spectre, "if you will go down to my grandson's house, and take such persons with you as you can trust, I will give you such instructions as that you shall find out the deed or settlement, which lies concealed in a place where I put it with my own hands, and where you shall direct my grandson to take it out in your presence." "But why, then, can you not direct your grandson himself to do this?" says the doctor. "Ask me not about that," says the apparition. "There are divers reasons, which you may know hereafter. I can depend upon your honesty in it in the meantime, and you may so dispose of matters that you shall have your expenses paid you and be handsomely allowed for your trouble." After this discourse, and several other expostulations, for the doctor was not easily prevailed upon to go till the spectre seemed to look angrily and even to threaten him for refusing, he did at last promise to go. Having obtained a promise of him, he told him he might let his grandson know that he had formerly conversed with his grandfather, but not how lately or in what manner, and asked to see the house, and that in such an upper room or loft he should see a deal of old lumber, old coffers, old chests, and such things as were out of fashion now, thrown by and piled up upon one another, to make room for fashionable furniture, cabinets, chests of drawers, and the like. That in such a particular corner was such a certain old chest, with an old broken lock upon it, and a key in it, which could neither be turned in the lock or pulled out. In that chest, says he, and in that place lies the grand deed or charter of the estate, which conveys the inheritance, and without which the family will be turned out of doors. After this discourse, the doctor promised to go down into the country and dispatch this important commission. The apparition, putting on a very pleasant and smiling aspect, thanked him, and disappeared. After some days, and within the time limited by the proposal of the spectre, the doctor went down accordingly into Somersetshire, and finding the gentleman's house very readily by the direction, knocked at the door and asked if he was at home, and after being told he was, and the servants informing their master it was a clergyman, the gentleman came to the door, and very courteously invited him in. After the doctor had been there some time, he observed the gentleman received him with unexpected civility, though a stranger, and without business. They entered upon many friendly discourses, and the doctor pretended to have heard much of the family, as so indeed he had, and of his grandfather, from whom, sir, says he, I perceive the estate more immediately descends to yourself. Aye, says the gentleman, and shook his head. My father died young, and my grandfather has left things so confused that for want of one principal writing, which is not yet come to hand, I have met with a great deal of trouble from a couple of cousins, my grandfather's brother's children, who have put me to very great expenses about it. And with that the doctor seemed a little inquisitive. But I hope you have got over it, sir, says he. No, truly, says the gentleman, to be so open with you, we shall never get quite over it, unless we can find this old deed, which, however, I hope we shall find, for I intend to make a general search after it. I wish with all my heart you may find it, sir, says the doctor. I don't doubt but we shall. I had a strange dream about it last night, says the gentleman. A dream about the writing, says the doctor. I hope it was that you should find it, then. I dreamed, says the other, that a strange gentleman came to me, that I had never seen in my life, and helped me to look for it. I don't know, but you are the man." "I should be very glad to be the man, I'm sure," says the doctor. "Nay," says the gentleman, "you may be the man to help me look after it." "Aye, sir," says the doctor, "I may help you to look after it indeed, and I'll do that with all my heart, but I would much rather be the man that should help you to find it. Pray, when do you intend to search?" "Tomorrow," says the gentleman. "I have appointed to do it." "But," says the doctor, "in what manner do you intend to search?" "Why," replies the gentleman, "'tis all our opinions that my grandfather was so very much concerned to preserve this writing, and had so much jealousy that some were about him would take it from him if they could, that he hid it here some place. And I am resolved to pull half the house down, but I'll find it, if it is above ground." "Truly," says the doctor, "he may have hid it so that you may pull the whole house down before you find it, and perhaps not then. I have known such things utterly lost by the very care taken to preserve them." "If it was made of something the fire would not destroy," says the gentleman, "I would burn the house down, but I would find it." "I suppose you have searched all the old gentleman's chests and trunks and coffers over and over," says the doctor. "Aye," says the gentleman, "and turned them all inside outward, and there they lay in a heap up in a great loft or garret, with nothing in them. Nay, we knocked 3 or 4 of them in pieces to search for private drawers, and then I burnt them for anger, though they were fine old cypress chests that cost money enough when they were in fashion." "I am sorry you burnt them," says the doctor. "Nay," says the gentleman, "I did not burn a scrap of them till they were all split to pieces, and it was not possible there could be anything there." This made the doctor a little easy, for he began to be surprised when he told him he had split some of them and burnt them. "Well," says the doctor, "if I cannot do you any service in your search, I'll come to see you again tomorrow, and wait upon you during it with my best good wishes." "Nay," says the gentleman, "I don't design to part with you, since you are so kind to offer me your help. You shall stay all night then, and be at the first of it." The doctor had now gained his point so far as to make himself acquainted and desirable in the house, and to have a kind of intimacy, so that though he made as if he would go, he did not want many entreaties to make him stay. Therefore he consented to lay in the house all night. A little before evening the gentleman asked him to take a walk in the park, but he put it off with a jest. "I had rather, sir," said he, smiling, "you'd let me see this fine old mansion house that is to be demolished tomorrow. Methinks I'd fain see the house once before you pull it down." "With all my heart," says the gentleman. So he took him immediately upstairs, showed him all the best apartments, and all his fine furniture and pictures, and coming to the head of the staircase where they came up, offered to go down again. "But, sir," says the doctor, "shall we not go up higher?" "There is nothing there," says he, "but garrets and old lofts full of rubbish, and a place to go out in the turret and the clock-house." "Oh, let me see it all. Now we are going," says the doctor. "I love to see the old lofty towers and turrets, the magnificence of our ancestors, though they are out of fashion now. Pray let us see all now." "Why, 'twill tire you," says the gentleman. "No, no," says the doctor. "If it don't tire you that have seen it so often, it won't tire me, I assure you. Pray let us go up." So away the gentleman goes, and the doctor after him. After they had rambled all over the wild part of this large house, I need not describe, he passed by a great room, the door of which was open, and in it a great deal of lumber. "And what place is this, pray?" says the doctor, but not offering to go in. "Oh, that's the room," says the gentleman softly, because there was a servant attending them. "That's the room I told you of, where all the rubbish lay, the chests, coffers, and trunks. Look there, see how they are piled up one upon another almost to the ceiling." With this the doctor goes and looks about him, for this was the place he was directed to, in which he went to see. He was not in the room 2 minutes, but he found everything just as the spectre in London had described. He went directly to the pile he had been told of, and fixed his eye upon the very chest with the old rusty lock upon it, with the key in it, which would neither turn round or come out. "On my word, sir," says the doctor, "you have taken pains enough, if you have rummaged all these drawers, chests, and coffers, and everything that may have been in them." "Indeed, sir," says the gentleman, "I have emptied every one of them myself, and looked over all the old musty writings one by one, with some help indeed, but they every one passed through my hand and under my eye." "Well, sir," says the doctor, "I see you have been in earnest, and I find the thing is of great consequence to you. I have a strange fancy come into my head this very moment. Will you gratify my curiosity with opening and emptying one small chest or coffer that I have cast my eye upon? There may be nothing in it. You are satisfied, I believe, that I was never here before, yet I have a strange notion there are some private places in it, which you have not found. Perhaps there may be nothing in them when they are found. The gentleman, looking at the chest, said, smiling, I remember opening it very well. And turning to his servant, Will, says he, don't you remember that chest? Yes, sir, says Will. Very well, I remember. You were so weary when you sat down upon the chest when everything was out of it, you clapped down the lid and sat down and sent me to my lady to bring you a dram of citron. You said you was ready to faint. Well, sir, 'tis only a fancy of mine, and very likely to have nothing in it. No matter for that, says the gentleman, you shall see it turned bottom up again before your face, and so you shall all the rest, if you do but speak the word. Well, sir, says the doctor, if you will oblige me with this one, I will trouble you no farther. Immediately the gentleman causes the coffer to be dragged out and opened, for it could not be locked. The key would neither lock it nor unlock it. When the papers were all out, the doctor, turning his face another way, as if he would look among the papers, but taking little or no notice of the chest, stooped down, and as if supporting himself with his cane, strikes his cane into the chest, but snatched it out again hastily, as if it had been a mistake, and turning to the chest, he claps the lid of it down, and sits down upon it as if he was weary too. However, he takes an opportunity to speak to the gentleman softly, to send away his man a moment. For I would speak a word or two with you, sir, says he, out of his hearing. And then, recollecting himself, continued aloud, Can you not send for a hammer and a chisel? Yes, sir, says the gentleman. Go, Will, fetch a hammer and chisel. As soon as Will was gone, Now, sir, says he, let me say a bold word to you. I have found your writing. I have found your grand deed of settlement. I'll lay you 100 guineas I have it in this coffer. The gentleman takes up the lid again, handles the chest, looks over every part of it, but could see nothing. He is confounded and amazed. What do you mean? Says he to the doctor. You have no unusual art, I hope, no conjuring in hand. Here is nothing but an empty coffer. Not I, upon my word, says the doctor. I am no magician, no cunning man. I abhor it. But I tell you again, the writing is in this coffer. The gentleman knocks and calls as if he was frighted, for his man with the hammer, but the doctor sat composed again upon the lid of the coffer. At last up comes the man with the hammer and chisel, and the doctor goes to work with the chest, knocks upon the flat of the bottom. Hark, says he, don't you hear it, sir? Don't you hear it plainly? Hear what? Says the gentleman. I don't understand you, indeed. Why, the chest has a double bottom, sir, a false bottom, says the doctor. Don't you hear it sound hollow? In a word, they immediately split the inner bottom open, and there lay the parchment spread abroad flat on the whole breadth of the bottom of the trunk, as a quire of paper is laid on the flat of a drawer. It is impossible for me to describe the joy and surprise of the gentleman, and soon after of the whole family, for the gentleman sent for his lady and 2 of his daughters up into the garret among all the rubbish, to see not the writing only, but the place where it was found, and the manner how. You may easily suppose the doctor was caressed with uncommon civilities in the family, and sent up, after about a week's stay, in the gentleman's own coach to London. I do not remember whether he disclosed the secret to the gentleman or no. I mean the secret of the apparition, by which the place where the writing was to be found was discovered to him, and who obliged him to come down on purpose to find it. I say I do not remember that part, neither is it material. As far as I have had the story related, so far I have handed it forward, and I have the truth of it affirmed in such a manner that I cannot doubt it. Mr. James Douch's account of the apparition of Major Sydenham to Captain William Dyke, taken from Mr. Aubrey's Miscellanies. Concerning the apparition of the ghost of Major George Sydenham, late of Dulverton, in the county of Somerset, to Captain William Dyke, late of Skilgate, in the same county, and now likewise deceased. Be pleased to take the relation of it as I have it from the worthy and learned Dr. Theodore Dyke, a near kinsman of the captain's, thus: Shortly after the major's death, the doctor was desired to come to the house to take care of a child that was there sick, and in his way thither he called on the captain, who was very willing to attend him to the place, because he must, as he said, have gone thither that night, though he had not met with such an encouraging opportunity. After their arrival at the house, and the civility of the people shown them in their entertainment, they were seasonably conducted to their lodging, which they desired might be together in the same bed, where after they had lain a while, the captain knocked, and bid the servant bring him 2 of the largest candles lighted that he could possibly get. Whereupon the doctor inquired what he meant by this. The captain answered, You know, cousin, what disputes my major and I have had touching the being of a god, and the immortality of the soul, in which points we never could be yet resolved, though we so much fought for and desired it, and therefore it was at length fully agreed between us that he of us that died first should the 3rd night after his funeral, between the hours of 12 and 1, come to the little house that is here in the garden, and there give a full account to the survivor touching these matters, who should be sure to be present at the set time, and to receive a full satisfaction. And this, said the captain, is the very night, and I am come on purpose to fulfill my promise. The doctor dissuaded him, reminding him of the danger of following those strange counsels, for which we could have no warrant, and that the devil might by some cunning device make such an advantage of this rash attempt as would work his utter ruin. The captain replied that he had solemnly engaged, and that nothing should discourage him, and added that if the doctor would sit up a while with him, he would thank him. If not, he might compose himself to rest, but for his own part he was resolved to watch, that he might be sure to be present at the hour appointed. To that purpose he set his watch by him, and as soon as he perceived by it that it was half an hour past 11, he rose, and took a candle in each hand, went out by the back door, of which he had before gotten the key, and walked to the garden house, where he continued 2 hours and a half, and at his return declared that he had neither seen nor heard anything more than what was usual. But I know, said he, that my major would surely have come, had he been able. About 6 weeks after, the captain rode to Eton to place his son a scholar there, when the doctor went thither with him. They lodged at an inn. The sign was the Christopher, and tarried 2 or 3 nights, not lying together now as before at Dulverton, but in 2 several chambers. The morning before they went thence, the captain stayed in his chamber longer than he was wont to do before he called upon the doctor. At length he came into the doctor's chamber, but in a visage and form much differing from himself, with his hair standing upright, and eyes staring, and his whole body shaking and trembling. Whereat the doctor, wondering, presently demanded what was the matter, cousin captain. The captain replied, I have seen my major. At which the doctor, seeming to smile, the captain immediately confirmed it, saying, If ever I saw him in my life, I saw him just now. And then he related to the doctor what had passed, thus: This morning, after it was light, one comes to my bedside, and suddenly drawing back the curtains, calls Cap Cap, which was the term of familiarity that the major used to call the captain by, to whom I replied, What, my major? To which he returns, I could not come at the time appointed, but I am now come to tell you that there is a God, and a very just and terrible one, and if you do not turn over a new leaf, the very expression, as is by the doctor punctually remembered, you will find it so. The captain proceeded, On the table by there lay a sword, which the major had formerly given me. Now after the apparition had walked a turn or 2 about the chamber, he took up the sword, drew it out, and finding it not so clean and bright as it ought, Cap, Cap, says he, this sword did not used to be kept after this manner when it was mine. After which words he suddenly disappeared. The captain was not only thoroughly persuaded of what he had seen and heard, but was from that time observed to be very much affected with it, and the humour that before in him was brisk and jovial was then strangely altered, insomuch that very little meat would pass down with him at dinner, though at their taking leave of their friends there was a very handsome treat provided. Yea, it was observed that what the captain had thus seen and heard had a more lasting influence upon him, and it was judged by those who were well acquainted with his conversation that the remembrance of this passage stuck close to him, and that those words of his dead friend were frequently sounding in his ears during the remainder of his life, which was about 2 years. Just such another story I heard related a few Sundays ago, the substance of which I took down as near as possible. 2 gentlemen, great libertines and ridiculers of all true religion, and truths of the gospel, in one of their gay humours, made an agreement that whichever of them should die first should come and acquaint the other what state he was in. Accordingly, one of them died soon, and a few nights after he appeared to his friend, and in much horror said, "I am come to let you know there is a hell, and I experience it," and vanished away. This story was related by the Reverend Mr. M., in a sermon preached at Blackfriars Church, and was brought in as a confirmation to the doctrine in the discourse he was upon, namely, on the rich man and Lazarus, Luke 16:30-31. And he, the rich man, said, "Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went unto them from the dead, they would repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, i.e., neither the threats of God's law, nor the promises of the gospel for their repentance, neither will they be persuaded through one, though one rose from the dead." This was verified in the surviving gentleman above mentioned. Although he was at first a little shocked at the words of his friend, yet it made no alteration or amendment in his life, for he had lived a libertine, and a despiser of all true religion, and of those who protest it. So he died, and Mr. M. said that he knew them both well. One of them was a near neighbor to him at the time. Oh, how dreadful the reflection that man, a rational creature, endued with clear understanding, and assisted with the light of the gospel, should so give himself up to wickedness and a reprobate mind, denying the truths of God's words, so as to plunge their poor souls into everlasting ruin with the devil and his angels. A wonderful relation of the apparition of old Sir George Villiers, father of the then Duke of Buckingham, to one Mr. Parker, to warn the Duke against something which, if not prevented, would end in his death, which so fell out, he not regarding the advice, and soon after he was stabbed by one John Felton, an officer. There were many stories scattered abroad at that time of several prophecies and predictions of the Duke's untimely and violent death. Amongst the rest, there was one that was upon a better foundation of credit. There was an officer in the King's Wardrobe in Windsor Castle of good reputation for honesty and discretion, and then about the age of 50 or more. This man had in his youth been bred in a school in the parish where Sir George Villiers, the father of the Duke, lived, and had been much cherished and much obliged in that season of his age by the said Sir George, whom afterwards he never saw. About 6 months before the miserable end of the Duke of Buckingham, at midnight, this man being in his bed at Windsor, where his office was, and in very good health, there appeared to him on the side of his bed a man of a very venerable aspect, who drew the curtains of his bed, and fixing his eyes upon him, asked him if he knew him. The poor man, half dead with fear and apprehension, being asked the second time whether he remembered him, and having in that time called to his memory the presence of Sir George Villiers, and the very clothes he used to wear, in which at that time he seemed to be habited, he answered him that he thought him to be that person. He replied that he was in the right, that he was the same, and that he expected a service from him, which was that he should go from him to his son, the Duke of Buckingham, and tell him, if he did not somewhat to ingratiate himself to the people, or at least to abate the extreme malice which they had against him, he would be suffered to live but a short time. After this discourse he disappeared, and the poor man, if he had been at all waking, slept very well till morning, when he believed all this to be a dream, and considered it no otherwise. The next night, or shortly after, the same person appeared to him again in the same place, and about the same time of the night, with an aspect a little more severe than before, and asked him whether he had done as he required of him, and perceiving he had not, gave him some severe reprehensions, told him he expected more compliance from him, and that if he did not perform his commands, he should enjoy no peace of mind, but should always be pursued by him, upon which he promised him to obey. But the next morning, Waking out of a good sleep, though he was exceedingly perplexed with the lively representation of all particulars to his memory, he was still willing to persuade himself he had only dreamed, and considered that he was a person at such a distance from the Duke that he knew not how to find out any admission to his presence, much less to be believed in what he should say. So with great trouble and unquietness he spent some time in thinking what he should do, and in the end resolved to do nothing in the matter. The same person appeared to him a third time with a terrible countenance, and bitterly reproached him for not performing what he had promised to do. The poor man had by this time recovered the courage to tell him in truth he had deferred the execution of his commands upon considering how difficult a thing it would be for him to get any access to the Duke, having acquaintance with no person about him, and if he should obtain admission to him, he never would be able to persuade him that he was sent in such a manner that he should at least be thought to be mad, or to be set on and employed by his own or the malice of other men to abuse the Duke, and he should be sure to be undone. The spectre replied, as he had done before, that he should never find rest till he had performed what he required, and therefore he had better to dispatch it, that the access to his son was known to be very easy, and that few men waited long for him, and for the gaining him credit he would tell him 2 or 3 particulars, which he charged him never to mention to any person but the Duke himself, and he should no sooner hear them than he should believe all the rest he should say, and so repeating his threats, he left him. In the morning the poor man, more confirmed by the last appearance, made his journey to London, where the court then was. He was very well known by Sir Ralph Freeman, one of the masters of requests, who had married a lady that was nearly allied to the Duke, and was himself well received by him. To him this man went, and though he did not acquaint him with all his particulars, he said enough to let him know that there was something extraordinary in it, and the knowledge he had of the sobriety and discretion of the man made the more impression on him. He desired that by his means he might be brought to the Duke in such a place and in such a manner as should be thought fit, affirming that he had much to say to him, and of a nature as would require much privacy, and some time and patience in the hearing. Sir Ralph promised that he would speak first to the Duke of him, and then he should understand his pleasure, and accordingly the first opportunity he did inform him of the reputation and honesty of the man, and then what he desired, and what he knew of the matter. The Duke, according to his usual openness and condescension, told him that he was the next day early to hunt with the king, that his horses should attend him at Lambeth Bridge, where he should land by 5 o'clock in the morning, and if the man attended him there at that hour, he would walk and speak with him as long as should be necessary. Sir Ralph carried the man with him the next morning, and presented him to the Duke at his landing, who received him courteously, and walked aside in conference near an hour, none but his own servants being at that hour in the place, and they and Sir Ralph at such a distance that they could not hear a word, though the Duke sometimes spoke loud and with great commotion, which Sir Ralph the more easily observed and perceived, because he kept his eyes always fixed upon the Duke, having procured the conference upon somewhat he knew was very extraordinary. The man told him in his return over the water that when he mentioned those particulars that was to gain him credit, the substance whereof he said he durst not impart unto him, the Duke's colour changed, and he swore he could come at that knowledge only by the devil, for that those particulars were only known to himself and to one person more, who he was sure would never speak of it. How strongly does this confirm the opinion that the soul, when departed, has a knowledge of the actions of the living, and willing to do any office for their good, if permitted. The Duke pursued his purpose of hunting, but was observed to ride all the morning with great pensiveness and in deep thought, without any delight in the exercise he was upon, and before the morning was spent, left the field, and alighted at his mother's lodgings in Whitehall, with whom he was shut up for the space of 2 or 3 hours, the noise of their discourse frequently reaching the ears of those who attended in the next rooms, and when the Duke left her, his countenance appeared full of trouble, with a mixture of anger, a countenance that was never before observed in him in any conversation with her, towards whom he had a profound reverence. And the Countess herself, for though she was married to a private gentleman, Sir Thomas Compton, she had been created Countess of Buckingham shortly after her son had first assumed that title, was, at the Duke's leaving her, found overwhelmed in tears, and in the highest agony imaginable. Whatever there was of all this, it is a notorious truth that when the news of the Duke's murder, which happened within a few months after, was brought to his mother, she seemed not in the least degree surprised, but received it as if she had foreseen it, nor did afterwards express such a degree of sorrow as was expected from such a mother for the loss of such a son. This story is related with some little circumstantial difference by several considerable authors who all seem to agree in the most material parts of it. Vide Baker's Chronicle. Fame, though with some privacy, says that the secret token was an incestuous breach of modesty between the Duke and a certain lady too nearly related to him, which it surprised the Duke to hear of, and that as he thought he had good reasons to be sure the lady would not tell of it herself, so he thought none but the devil could tell it besides her, and this astonished him, so that he was very far from receiving the man slightly or laughing at his message. A considerable time before this happened, Sir Clement Throckmorton dreamed that an assassin would kill his grace. Therefore he took the first opportunity to advise him to wear a privy coat. The Duke thanked him for his counsel very kindly, but gave him this answer, that he thought a coat of mail would signify little in a popular commotion, and from any single person he apprehended no danger. Relic Wotton, page 144. This relation is recorded by 3 different authors, viz. Mr. Lilly, the astrologer, in a work of his, Lord Clarendon's History of England, and Mr. Baker's Chronicle. It is also mentioned by Mr. Flavel in his treatise on the soul. And that concluded Chapter 2. Let's go on to Chapter 3. This chapter is going to include the stories Apparition at Launceston in Cornwall, of Miss Pringle to Mrs. Lowe, her father's housekeeper, Unaccountable Communication of the Mind to a Young Man Well at a Place of Worship, and Spirit of a Man Just Deceased, seen by Mr. Weston of Old Swinford. An account of an apparition attested by the Reverend Mr. Ruddle, minister at Launceston in Cornwall. In the beginning of the year 1665, a disease happened in this part of Launceston, and some of my scholars died of it. Among others who fell under its malignity was John Eliot, the eldest son of Edward Eliot of Trebers, Esquire, a stripling of about 16 years of age, but of uncommon parts and ingenuity. At his own particular request, I preached at the funeral which happened on the 10th day of June, 1665. In my discourse I spoke some words in commendation of the young gentleman, such as might endear his memory to those who knew him, and withal tend to preserve his example to those who went to school with him, and were to continue after him. An ancient gentleman, who was then in the church, was much affected with the discourse, and often heard to repeat the same evening one expression I then used out of Virgil. Et pur ipse fuit cantari digmus. The reason why this grave gentleman was so concerned at the character was a reflection made upon a son of his own, who being about the same age, and but a few months before, not unworthy of the like character I gave of the young Mr. Eliot, was now by a strange accident quite lost as to his parents' hopes, and all expectations of any further comfort by him. The funeral rites being over, I was no sooner come out of the church, but I found myself most courteously accosted by this old gentleman, and with an unusual importunity, almost forced against my humour to his house that night, nor could I have rescued myself from his kindness had not Mr. Eliot interposed and pleaded title to me for the whole day, which, as he said, he would resign to no man. Hereupon I got loose for that time, but was constrained to leave a promise behind me to wait upon him at his own house the Monday following. This then seemed to satisfy, but before Monday came, I had a new message to request me that if it were possible I would be there the Sunday. The second attempt I resisted by answering that it was against my convenience and the duty which mine own people expected from me. Yet was not the gentleman at rest, for he sent me another letter the Saturday, by no means to fail the Monday, and so to order my business as to spend with him 2 or 3 days at least. I was indeed startled at so much eagerness, and so many dunnings for a visit without any business, and began to suspect that there must needs be some design in the bottom of all this excess of courtesy, for I had no familiarity, scarce common acquaintance with the gentleman or his family, nor could I imagine whence should arise such a flush of friendship on the sudden. On the Monday I went and paid my promised devoir, and met with entertainment as free and plentiful as the invitation was importunate. There also I found a neighboring minister, who pretended to call in accidentally, but by the sequel I suppose it otherwise. After dinner this brother of the coat undertook to show me the gardens, where, as we were walking, he gave me the first discovery of what was mainly intended in all this treat and compliment. First he began to inform me of the infelicity of the family in general, and then gave instance in the youngest son. He related what a hopeful, sprightly lad he lately was, and how melancholic and sottish he was now grown. Then did he with much passion lament that his ill humour should so incredibly subdue his reason. Saith he, the poor boy believes himself to be haunted with ghosts, and is confident that he meets with an evil spirit in a certain field about 1/2 a mile from this place as often as he goes that way to school. In the midst of our discourse the old gentleman and his lady, as observing their cue most exactly, came up to us. Upon their approach, and pointing me to the arbor, the parson renewed the relation so, and they, the parents of the youth, confirmed what he said, and added many minute circumstances in a long narrative of the whole. In fine, they all three desired my thoughts and advice in the affair. I was not able to collect my thoughts enough on the sudden to frame a judgment upon what they had said, only I answered that the thing which the youth reported to them was strange, yet not incredible, and that I knew not then what to think or say of it, but if the lad would be free to me in talk and trust me with his counsels, I had hopes to give them a better account of my opinion the next day. I had no sooner spoken so much, but I perceived myself in the springe their courtesy had laid for me. For the old lady was not able to hide her impatience, but her son must be called immediately. This I was forced to comply with, and consent to, so that, drawing off from the company to an orchard hard by, she went herself, and brought him to me, and left him with me. It was the main drift of all these three to persuade me that either the boy was lazy, and glad of any excuse to keep from the school, or that he was in love with some wench, and ashamed to confess it, or that he had a fetch upon his father to get money and new clothes, that he might range to London after a brother he had there, and therefore they begged of me to discover the root of the matter, and accordingly to dissuade, advise, or reprove him, but chiefly by all means to undeceive him as to the fancy of ghosts and spirits. I soon entered a close conference with the youth, and at first was very cautious not to displease him, but by smooth words to ingratiate myself and get within him, for I doubted he would be too distrustful or too reserved. But we had scarce passed the first situation and began to speak to the business before I found that there needed no policy to screw myself into his heart, for he most openly and with all obliging candor did aver that he loved his book and desired nothing more than to be bred a scholar, that he had not the least respect for any of womankind as his mother gave out, and that the only request he would make to his parents was that they would but believe his constant assertions concerning the woman he was disturbed with in the field called the Higher Broom Quartils. He told me, with all naked freedom and a flood of tears, that his friends were unkind and unjust to him, neither to believe nor pity him, and that if any man, making a bow to me, would but go with him to the place, he might be convinced that the thing was real, etc. By this time he found me apt to compassionate his condition, and to be attentive to his relation of it, and therefore he went on in this manner. This woman which appears to me, said he, lived a neighbor here to my father, and died about 8 years since. Her name, Dorothy Dingley, of such a stature, such age, and such complexion. She never speaks to me, but passeth by hastily, and always leaves the footpath to me, and she commonly meets me 2 or 3 times in the breadth of the field. It was about 2 months before I took any notice of it, and though the shape of the face was in my memory, yet I could not recall the name of the person, but without more thoughtfulness I did suppose it was some woman who lived thereabout, and had frequent occasion that way, nor did I imagine anything to the contrary, before she began to meet me constantly, morning and evening, and always in the same field, and sometimes twice or thrice in the breadth of it. The first time I took notice of her was about a year since, and when I began to suspect and believe it to be a ghost, I had courage enough not to be afraid, but kept it to myself a good while, and only wondered very much at it. I did often speak to it, but never had a word in answer. Then I changed my way and went to school the Underhorse Road, and then she always met me in the narrow lane between the Quarry Park and the nursery, which was worse. At length I began to be terrified at it, and prayed continually that God would either free me from it or let me know the meaning of it. Night and day, sleeping and waking, the shape was ever running in my mind, and I often did repeat these places in Scripture. With that he took a small Bible out of his pocket. Job chapter 7:14. Thou scarest me with dreams, and terrifieth me through visions, and Deuteronomy 28:67. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were evening, and at evening thou shalt say, Would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart, wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. I was very much pleased with the lad's ingenuity in the application of these pertinent scriptures to his condition, and desired him to proceed. Thus said he, By degrees I grew very pensive, insomuch that it was taken notice of by all our family, whereupon being urged to it, I told my brother William of it, and he privately acquainted my mother and father, and they kept it to themselves for some time. The success of this discovery was only this: they did sometimes laugh at me, sometimes chide me, but still commanded me to keep my school, and put such fopperies out of my head. I did accordingly go to school often, but always met the woman in the way. This and much more to the same purpose, yea, as much as held a dialogue of near 2 hours, was our conference in the orchard, which ended with my proffer to him that, without making any privy to our intents, I would next morning walk with him to the place about 6 o'clock. He was even transported with joy at the mention of it, and replied, But will you sure, sir? Will you really, sir? Thank God, now I hope I shall be believed. From this conclusion we retired into the house. The gentleman, his wife, and Mr. Williams were impatient to know the event, insomuch that they came out of the parlor into the hall to meet us, and seeing the lad look cheerfully, the first compliments from the old man was, Come, Mr. Ruddle, you have talked with Sam. I hope now he will have more wit. An idle boy, an idle boy. At these words the lad ran upstairs to his chamber without replying, and I soon stopped the curiosity of the 3 expectants by telling them I had promised silence, and was resolved to be as good as my word, but when things were riper they might know all. At present I desired them to rest in my faithful promise that I would do my utmost in their service, and for the good of their son. With this they were silenced. I cannot say satisfied. The next morning before 5 o'clock the lad was in my chamber, and very brisk. I arose and went with him. The field he led me to I guessed to be 20 acres, in an open country, and about 3 furlongs from any house. We went into the field, and had not gone above a 3rd part before the spectrum, in the shape of a woman, with all the circumstances he had described her to me in the orchard the day before, as much as the suddenness of its appearance and evolution would permit me to discover it, met us and passed by. I was a little surprised at it, and though I had taken up a firm resolution to speak to it, yet I had not the power, nor indeed durst I look back. Yet I took care not to show my fear to the pupil and guide, and therefore telling him that I was satisfied in the truth of his complaint, we walked to the end of the field and returned, nor did the ghost meet us at that time above once. I perceived in the young man a kind of boldness mixed with astonishment, the first caused by my presence and the proof he had given of his own relation, and the other by the sight of his prosecutor. In short, we went home, I somewhat puzzled, he much animated. At our return, the gentlewoman, whose inquisitiveness had miffed us, watched to speak with me. I gave her a convenience, and told her that my opinion was that her son's complaint was not to be slighted, nor altogether discredited, yet that my judgment in his case was not settled. I gave her caution, moreover, that the thing might not take wind, lest the whole country should ring with what we yet had no assurance of. In this juncture of time I had business which would admit no delay, wherefore I went to Launceston that evening, but promised to see them again next week. Yet I was prevented by an occasion which pleaded a sufficient excuse, for my wife was that week brought home very ill. However, my mind was upon the adventure. I studied the case, and about 3 weeks after went again, resolving, by the help of God, to see the utmost. The next morning, being the 27th day of July 1665, I went to the haunted field myself, and walked the breadth of it without any encounter. I returned and took the other walk, and then the spectrum appeared to me much about the same place I saw it before when the young gentleman was with me. In my thoughts this moved swifter than the time before, and about 10 foot distant from me on my right hand, insomuch that I had not time to speak to it, as I had determined with myself beforehand. The evening of this day, the parents, the son, and myself, being in the chamber where I lay, I proposed to them our going all together to the place next morning, and some asseveration that there was no danger in it, we all resolved upon it. The morning being come, lest we should alarm the family of servants, they went under the pretence of seeing a field of wheat, and I took my horse and fetched a compass another way, and so met at the stile we had appointed. Thence we all four walked leisurely into the quartles, and had passed above half the field before the ghost made its appearance. It then came over the stile just before us, and moved with that swiftness that by the time we had gone 6 or 7 steps it passed by. I immediately turned my head and ran after it, with the young man by my side. We saw it pass over the stile at which we entered, but no farther. I stepped upon the hedge at one place, and he at another, but could discern nothing, whereas I dare aver that the swiftest horse in England could not have conveyed himself out of sight in that short space of time. 2 things I observed in this day's appearance. 1. That a spaniel dog, who followed the company unregarded, did bark and run away as the spectrum passed by, where 'tis easy to conclude that 'twas not our fear or fancy which made the apparition. 2. That the motion of the spectre was not gradatim, or by steps and moving of the feet, but a kind of gliding, as children upon the ice, or a boat down a swift river, which punctually answers the descriptions the ancients gave of the motion of their lemurs. But to proceed, this ocular evidence clearly convinced, but withal strangely affrighted, the old gentleman and his wife, who knew this Dorothy Dingley in her lifetime, were at her burial, and now plainly saw her features in this present apparition. I encouraged them as well as I could, but after this they went no more. However, I was resolved to proceed, and use such lawful means as God hath discovered, and learned men have successfully practised in these uncommon cases. The next morning being Thursday, I went out very early by myself, and walked for about an hour's space in meditation and prayer in the fields next adjoining to the quartles. Soon after 5, I stepped over the stile into the disturbed field, and had not gone above 30 or 40 paces before the ghost appeared at the farther stile. I spake to it with a loud voice, in some such sentences as the way of these dealings directed me, whereupon it approached but slowly, and when I came near it moved not. I spake again, and it answered in a voice neither very audible nor intelligible. I was not in the least terrified, and therefore persisted until it spake again, and gave me satisfaction. But the work could not be finished at this time, wherefore the same evening, an hour after sunset, it met me again near the same place, and after a few words of each side it quietly vanished, and neither doth appear since, nor ever will more, to any man's disturbance. The discourse in the morning lasted about a quarter of an hour. These things are true, and I know them to be so with as much certainty as eyes and ears can give me, and until I can be persuaded that my senses do deceive me about their proper object, and by that persuasion deprive myself of the strongest inducement to believe the Christian religion, I must and will assert that these things in this paper are true. As for the manner of my proceeding, I find no reason to be ashamed of it, for I can justify it to men of good principles discretion, and recondite learning, though in this case I chose to content myself in the assurance of the thing, rather than be at the unprofitable trouble to persuade others to believe it. For I know full well with what difficulty relations of so uncommon a nature and practice obtain belief. He that tells such a story may expect to be dealt withal as a traveller in Poland by the robbers, viz., first murdered and then searched, first condemned for a liar or superstitious, and then, when 'tis too late, have his reasons and proofs examined. This incredulity may be attributed, first, to the infinite abuses of the people, and impositions upon their faith by the cunning monks and friars, etc., in the days of darkness and popery. For they made apparitions as often as they pleased, and got both money and credit, by quieting the terticulamenta vulgi which their own artifice had raised. Secondly, to the prevailing of Samitism and Hobbian principles in these times, which is a revival of the doctrine of the Sadducees, and as it denies the nature, so cannot consist with the apparitions of spirits, of which see Leviath P1 C12. Thirdly, to the ignorance of men in our age, in this peculiar and mysterious part of philosophy and religion, namely, the communication between spirits and men. Not one scholar of 10,000, though otherwise of excellent learning, knows anything of it, or the way how to manage it. This ignorance breeds fear and abhorrence of that which otherwise might be of incomparable benefit to mankind. But I, being a clergyman, and young, and a stranger in these parts, do apprehend silence and secrecy to be my best security. In rebus abstrusissimus abundans cavit ella non nocet. Miss Pringle's appearance at two places at the same time. Mrs. Jane Lowe, housekeeper to Mr. Pringle of Clifton Park in the south of Scotland, one morning in the summer of 1745, beheld the apparition of a lady walking in the avenue on the margin of a rivulet, which runs into Cale water. The form exactly resembled a daughter of her master who had long been absent from the family, at the distance of above 100 miles south of Paris. As Mrs. Lowe walked down the avenue and approached the rivulet, she grew more and more certain of the similitude of the phantom to the idea in her mind of the Miss Pringle, and seeing her master in an enclosure adjoining, she communicated to him what she had just seen. Mr. Pringle laughed and said, "You simple woman, that lady is Miss Chatto of Moorbattle." However, Mrs. Lowe prevailed upon him to accompany her to the place, which they had nearly reached when the apparition sprung into the water and instantly disappeared. Mr. Pringle and Mrs. Lowe, on returning to the hall, apprised the family of the vision, and for their pains were heartily laughed at. The Reverend Mr. Turnbull, minister of Linton, happened to breakfast that morning with Mr. Pringle, his lady, and two young daughters, who joined the ridicule. About 3 months after, the same reverend gentleman honored the family with his company. When standing at a window in the lower room, he observed a poor, ragged, lame, lean man slowly approaching the house. "Here comes another apparition," cried Mr. Turnbull with a kind of contemptuous smile. This drew the immediate attention of all present, and Mr. Pringle quickly recognized the person to be his second son, whom he had not seen before for above 10 years. On his arrival, he soon convinced them he was no apparition, declaring that he had narrowly escaped with his life from Tunis, in the vicinity of which he had been a slave to the Algerines 7 years, but had happily been ransomed at the critical moment when he was ordered to be put to death for mutiny. He added that on his return home through France, he called at the place where he had heard his sister resided, and to his unspeakable grief found that she died on the 25th of May, the same summer, about 5 o'clock in the morning, which he recollected to have been the precise time that he was saved from the jaws of death, and when he thought he beheld his sister. Mrs. Lowe, who was present in the room, on hearing his declaration, broke forth into an acclamation, affirming that the day alluded to was that on which she had shown Mr. Pringle the apparition, and this was confirmed by the Reverend Divine, in whose study this story was found after his death. The following fact recently appeared on the evidence upon oath of a youth at the session of the Old Bailey. The young man, being servant to a silk mercer in New Street, Covent Garden, was one Sunday entrusted with the sole care of the house. In the evening, having, as he thought, properly secured the place, he ventured out to an evening lecture in the city, where he had not been long present when, by a sudden and unaccountable emotion in his mind, he imagined that all was not safe at home. At first he paid but little regard to the intimation, but the idea of a robbery continuing to operate upon his fancy, he was prevailed to retire and immediately return home. On his arrival at the corner of New Street, he discovered the shop door unbarred and half open. On rushing into the shop, 2 men ran past him with the utmost precipitation. He followed fast, cried, "Stop, thief!" and they were taken and conveyed to the watch-house. All the most valuable goods in the shop, to the amount of several £100, were packed up. Several implements of housebreaking were found on the thieves and in the shop. The miscreants were committed, tried, convicted, and executed, justice having been first moved by an invisible agent, who, like the vapor in the brain of King Ahasuerus the Persian, would not suffer her that night to rest till 2 old offenders were fast in her hands, the good of the mercer happily saved, and the integrity of the shopman vindicated. Spirit of a poor man just deceased, appearing, is the means of a gentleman's preservation. Mr. Weston of Old Swinford, in Worcestershire, was walking one evening in the summer of 1759 in the park of Lord Littleton at Hagley, and being overtaken by a sudden shower, ran for shelter into a grotto, and stood under a spreading oak under whose shade several cattle were standing. He had not been 10 minutes in that situation before he saw the form of a man pass over the brook almost close to the shade. Supposing it to be a poor peasant who had long worked for him, he called him by name, but received no answer, and the apparition quickly disappearing, he found his mind much agitated. Regardless of the storm, Mr. Weston withdrew from the place where he had sought an asylum, and ran round a rising hill in order to discover the form which had presented itself to him. That, however, had not the effect desired, but one abundantly more salutary it certainly had, for just as he had gained the summit of the hill, on his return to the grotto, a tremendous flash of lightning darted in its forked fury on the venerable oak, shivered it to pieces, and killed 2 of the cattle under its boughs. On Mr. Weston's return to Swinford, he found that the death of the labourer was just announced in the neighbourhood. He told the story to his friends, who, on the ground of his known veracity, could not well refuse it credit. He saw the body, at his own expense, decently interred, and afterwards contributed to the support of the widow, not only by remitting a year's rent for her cottage and piece of ground, but also by settling a small annuity upon her till she should marry. We have told this tale simply as it was related by Mr. Weston, and leave the reader to make his own reflections on so marvelous an interposition of divine providence, without deciding in this or such other case whether the form that appeared was the soul of the deceased, exerting its philanthropy in its flight to the unknown country, or the guardian angel of that soul returning to give up his charge and produce his account at the bar of the Supreme. When Peter was redeemed from death and freed from prison by a miraculous power, he visited the assembled company of Christians, who at first could hardly believe their eyes that it was the apostle, but said, "It is his angel." This proves that the notion of ministering spirits prevailed in the earliest age of Christianity, a notion which not only accords with many passages of the Old, but also of the New Testament. And there we're done with Chapter 3. I've been trying to keep these episodes to an hour, but Chapter 4 is pretty short, and then we've reached Part 2 of the book. So I think we're going to go a little over an hour here and just breeze through Chapter 4 as quickly as possible. Here we go. Chapter 4. Warning given by a strange messenger to James IV at Linlithgow Church. Apparition at Belfast in Ireland from Mr. Baxter, of one brother in London to another at Boston in New England. story communicated by Sir Charles Lee, and account of Mr. John Bourne of Durley in Ireland. Warning given by a strange messenger to James IV at Linlithgow Church. That there is a spiritual world inhabited by spirits, angels, and happy beings, and that of a very different nature and constitution from what we live in here, is a truth acknowledged by the whole Christian world, and although no angel has come down from heaven to declare and explain the nature of their being to us, nor any man whilst in the body hath ascended up and seen it, yet that we should not be entirely ignorant in this particular, it has happened from time to time that many credible witnesses have, upon some extraordinary occasions, received warnings and messages from both the heavenly and hellish kingdoms of spirits. The following relation is taken from the Annals of the Kingdom of Scotland. While James IV stayed at Linlithgow to gather up the scattered remains of his army, which had been defeated by the Earl of Surrey at Floddenfield, he went into the church of St. Michael there to hear evening prayer. While he was at his devotion, a remarkable figure of an ancient man, with flowing amber-colored hair hanging over his shoulders, his forehead high and inclining to baldness, his garments of a fine blue color, somewhat long and girded together with a fine white cloth, of comely and very reverend aspect, was seen inquiring for the king. When his majesty being pointed out to him, he made his way through the crowd till he came to him, and then, with a clownish simplicity, leaning over the canon's seat, he addressed him in the following words: "Sir, I am sent hither to entreat you to delay your intended expedition for this time, and proceed no farther. For if you do, you will be unfortunate, and not prosper in your enterprise, nor any of your followers. I am further charged to warn you not to follow the acquaintance, company, or counsel of women, as you value your life, honor, and estate." After giving him this admonition, he withdrew himself back again through the crowd and disappeared. When service was ended, the king inquired earnestly after him, but he could not be found or heard of anywhere, neither could any of the bystanders, of whom many narrowly watched him, resolving afterwards to have discoursed with him, feel or perceive how, when, or where he passed from them, having, in a manner, vanished from their sight. Apparition at Belfast in Ireland, from Baxter's Certainty of the World of Spirits. And I have to make a real brief interjection here, because you may remember that in the last episode, in one of these stories, I said there was an asterisk leading to a footnote that said Certainty of the World of Spirits. And at the time, I thought it was a comment by the editor saying that particular story was Certainty of the World of Spirits, but now I understand. The story was from the book Certainty of the World of Spirits. I apologize for any confusion. I was confused myself. These are all interesting stories, but I just wasn't sure why that one was hardcore proof, but now we understand, so let's proceed. There having been a long contest between Lemuel Matthews, archdeacon in the county of Down, and Claudius Gilbert, minister of Belfast, about their right to Drumbeg, a small parish near Belfast, it proved troublesome to the parishioners who paid their dues to Mr. Gilbert, the incumbent. The archdeacon claimed it to be paid to him also, for which he procured a warrant, and in the execution of it by his servants at the house of one Charles Lofton, they offered some violence to his wife, who refused entrance, and who died of the injury a few weeks after. But she being an infirm woman, little notice was taken of her death till some time after by her strange appearance to one Thomas Donaldson, a spectator of the violence done to her. She affrighted him into a prosecution of Robert Eccleston, the criminal. She appeared divers times, but chiefly upon one Lord's Day evening, when she fetched him with a strange force out of his house into the yard, and fields adjacent. Before her last coming, for she did so 3 times that day, several neighbors were called in, to whom he gave notice that she was again coming, and beckoned to him to come out, upon which they went to shut the door, but he forbade it, saying that she looked with a terrible aspect upon him when they offered it. His friends laid hold on him, and embraced him that he might not again go out, notwithstanding which, a plain evidence of some invisible power, he was drawn out of their hands in a surprising manner, and carried abroad into the field and yard as before, she charging him to prosecute Eccleston, which voice, as also Donelson's reply, the people heard, though they saw no shape. There are many witnesses of all this yet alive, particularly Sarah, the wife of Charles Lofton, son to the deceased woman, and one William Holliday and his wife, etc. Upon this, Donelson deposed what he knew before Mr. Randall Bryce, a justice of the peace, and confirmed all at the assizes at Down in the year 1685, as I remember, where the several witnesses were sworn, and their examinations were entered in the records of the said assize, to the amazement and satisfaction of all the country, and of the judges, whom I have heard speak of it at that time with much wonder, insomuch that the said Eccleston hardly escaped with his life, but was burnt in the hand. The said Donelson is yet living in the same place with the other witnesses. All this, says Mr. Baxter, I heard spoken of myself with universal amazement at the time when transacted, and I should not have been beholden to any to have believed this relation who had been at the trial at Down. True account of an apparition of one brother in London to another at Boston in New England. The party in London of whom we relate lived here with a merchant, and as he drove a considerable trade beyond sea, he established a factory, or, as the language of trade calls it, a house, at a certain port in the English colonies in America, and sent over his servants or apprentices thither, as is usual for merchants to do. One of his said apprentices being fitted out and ready to embark, his cargo being actually on board the ship, and the ship fallen down to Gravesend, his master was getting his letters and invoices and other dispatches ready for him, he being to go down the river the same evening. The hurry of dispatching him prevented his master from taking him up to dinner with him at the usual hour, and told him he must be content to stay in the counting-house till he came to relieve him. Accordingly, dinner being over, he goes down to send him up to dinner, and when he came to the counting-house door, there sat his man with the bookkeeper also, writing as he left him. It happened just that moment. Some occasion extraordinary obliged him to step back again and go upstairs to the dining-room, from whence he came, and intending not to stay, he did not speak to the young man, but left him in the counting-house, and went immediately upstairs. It was not possible that he, or anyone else, except such as could walk invisibly, could go by or pass him unseen. Good manners would have hindered the young man from thrusting by his master upon the stairs if he had been going up, but he is positive he did not, and could not pass without being seen. But when he came to the top of the stairs, there sat the young man at dinner with the other servants, the room they dined in being a little parlor, which opened just against the stairs, so that he saw him all the way of the upper part of the staircase, and could not be deceived. The master did not speak to him, which he was very sorry for afterwards, but the surprise made him pass by the room, and go into the dining-room, which was to the right hand of it, but he sent one immediately to look, and he was there really at dinner, so that what he, the master, saw below in the counting-house must be the apparition, as it certainly was. But this was not all. The young gentleman embarked as above, and arrived safe with all his effects in America, though he never lived to return. However, I cannot say his apparition, in the manner as related, could have the least relation to his being sick and dying abroad, which was not till 3 years afterwards, but what followed was of another kind. This young man had an elder brother who lived in London. He was a gentleman and a scholar, and was at that time studying physic. He was also a stout man, and in particular understood a sword, that is to say, how to use a sword, as well as most gentlemen in England. He had an accidental rencounter with a gentleman in the street, in that short street which goes out of Fleet Street into Salisbury Court, and being so complete a master of his weapon, he wounded his antagonist, and drove him into a tavern in the street, from whence came out 2 men more upon him with their swords, but both of them found the gentleman so much an overmatch for them, that they left him as fast as the first. Whereupon a 4th came out, not with the sword, but a fire-poker, taken hastily out of the tavern kitchen, and running at this gentleman with it, knocked him down and fractured his skull, of which wound he afterwards died. While this was done in London, His brother, as far off as Boston in New England, writing to his master, the merchant, and who gives this account of it, after other business, wrote this postscript: Sir, I beg you will be pleased, in your return to this, to let me have some account, as much as conveniently may be, how my brother does, and what condition he is in, which importunity I hope you will excuse when you read the following account. On the 20th of June last, about 6 o'clock in the morning, lying in bed and broad awake, my brother, or an apparition of my brother, came to the bed's feet and opened the curtain, looking full in my face, but did not speak. I was very much frighted, but however, I so far recovered as to say to him, Brother, what is the matter with you? He had a napkin cap on his head, which was very bloody. He looked very pale and ghastly, and said, I am basely murdered by one, naming the person, but I shall have justice done me, and then disappeared. Now this letter was so dated that it was impossible any account could have been sent of the disaster that could reach thither in that time, for it was not dated above 14 days after the fact was committed in London, and that it was genuine I am well assured, because I saw the letter within an hour after it was received in London, read it myself, and knew the young man's hand, and the young man also perfectly well, as I likewise did his brother that was killed, very intimately. The young man was sober, religious, and sensible, not given to whimsy, or light-headed fancies, nor vaporish or distempered, not apt to see double or to dream waking, as many of our apparition-making people are. He was likewise a scholar and a very serious person. The first I mention as a protection to him from foolish imagination, and the last from falsehood, and I am satisfied the reader may depend upon both the stories as to the truth of them. Morton on Apparitions. The following account was communicated by Sir Charles Lee to the Lord Bishop of Gloucester, and afterwards published by Mr. Beaumont in his Treatise of Spirits. Sir Charles Lee, by his first lady, had only one daughter, of which she died in childbirth, and when she died, her sister, the Lady Everard, desired to have the education of the child, and she was by her very well educated till she was marriageable, and a match was concluded for her with Sir William Perkins, but was then prevented in an extraordinary manner. Upon a Thursday night, she, thinking she saw a light in her chamber after she was in bed, knocked for her maid, who presently came to her, and she asked why she left a candle burning in her chamber. The maid said she left none, and there was none, but what she brought with her at that time. Then she said it was the fire, but that, the maid told her, was quite out, and said she believed it was only a dream, whereupon she said it might be so, and composed herself again to sleep. But about 2 of the clock she was awaked again, and saw the apparition of a little woman between her curtain and her pillow, who told her she was her mother, and that she was happy, and that by 12 of the clock that day she should be with her. Whereupon she knocked again for the maid, called for her clothes, and when she was dressed, went into her closet, and came not out again till 9, and then brought out with her a letter sealed to her father, gave it to her aunt, the Lady Everard, told her what had happened, and desired that as soon as she was dead it might be sent to him. But the lady thought she was suddenly fallen mad, and thereupon sent presently away to Chelmsford for a physician and surgeon, who both came immediately. But the physician could discern no indication of what the lady imagined, or any indisposition of her body. Notwithstanding, the lady would needs have let her blood, which was done accordingly. And when the young woman had patiently let them do what they would with her, she desired that the chaplain might be called to read prayers. And when prayers were ended, she took her guitar and psalm book, and sat down upon a chair without arms, and played and sung so melodiously and admirably that her music master, who was then there, admired at it. And near the stroke of 12 she rose and sat herself down in a great chair with arms, and presently, fetching a strong breathing or two, immediately expired, and was so suddenly cold as was much wondered at by the physician and surgeon. She died at Waltham in Essex, 3 miles from Chelmsford, and the letter was sent to Sir Charles at his house in Warwickshire, but he was so afflicted with the death of his daughter that he came not till she was buried. But when he came, he caused her to be taken up, and to be buried by the side of her mother at Edmonton, as she desired in her letter. This was about the year 1662 or 63. Last story in Chapter 4. The story of Mr. John Bourne of Durley in Ireland, about a mile from Bridgewater, counsellor at law. Mr. John Bourne, for his skill, care, and honesty, was made by his neighbour John Mallet, Esquire, of Enmore, the chief of his trustees for his son John Mallet, father to Elizabeth, now Countess Dowager of Rochester, and the rest of his children in minority. He had the reputation of a worthy good man, and was commonly taken notice of for an habitual saying, by way of interjection almost to anything, viz., "You say true, you are in the right." This Mr. Bourne fell sick at his house in Durley in the year 1654, and Dr. Raymond of Oak was sent for to him, who after some time gave the said Mr. Bourne over. And he had not now spoke in 24 hours, when the said Dr. Raymond and Mrs. Carlyle, Mr. Bourne's nephew's wife, whose husband he made one of his heirs, sitting by his bedside, the doctor opened the curtains at the bed's feet to give him air, when on a sudden, to the horror and amazement of Dr. Raymond and Mrs. Carlyle, the great iron chest by the window at his bed's feet, with 3 locks to it, in which were all the writings and evidences of the said Mr. Mallet's estate, began to open, first one lock, then another, then the third. Afterwards the lid of the said iron chest lifted up itself, and stood wide open. Then the patient Mr. Bourne, who had not spoke in 24 hours, lifted himself up also, and looking upon the chest, cried, "You say true, you are in the right, I'll be with you by and by." So the patient lay down and spake no more. Then the chest fell again of itself, and locked itself one lock after another, as the 3 locks opened, and they tried to knock it open and could not, and Mr. Bourne died within an hour after. That concludes Chapter 4. And all of the stories that I've been reading comprised Book 1 of this entire book. So next time we're going to be starting with Book 2. I'd say we're about a third of the way through this whole book, so there's lots and lots of ghost stories yet to come, a lot of ground to cover. I'll see you next time.